I want to thank our supporter, the Heidelberg University Association, for their initiative to organize today's event. And I'd like to welcome and thank Professor Rainer Sauerborn here for doing his presentation today. Among many other things in his career, Professor Sauerborn figured as an advisor to the German federal government on global environmental changes, but you will hear more about him and from him, of course, in a few minutes. Just a few words about our center. The DWIH, the German Center for Research and Innovation, was founded on the initiative of the German Federal Foreign Office, which is currently promoting 5 such centers around the world in Sao Paulo, New Delhi, Moscow, Tokyo, and here in New York City. Today, we have a web talk related to life and society in big cities. So we have to be aware that urbanization has not stopped. It's an ongoing process. People live in huge metro areas like in New York or in middle-sized towns like Heidelberg. And we are very pleased to see today that today's topic, bottom up means top down, how urban citizens can reap health benefits from climate-friendly actions, is part of a series of lectures and panel discussions that debate the future of our cities and how we can organize and design them in order to make them less harmful to our climate and to organize them in a way that they support good health conditions of their inhabitants. And this turned out to be very important, especially during our times during the pandemic. So thank you all of you for tuning in. I wish you an exciting web talk. And with this, I hand over to my colleague Amanda D'Aquila, Director of the Heidelberg University Association Liaison Office here in New York. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, also for your continued support. And thank you to everyone in our audience for joining us today. As Ben mentioned, my name is Amanda D'Aquila, and I'm the director of the Heidelberg University Association, which is Heidelberg University's North American office here in New York. I'm excited to welcome you to the 3rd event in a series entitled Sustainable Megacities, Health, Risks, Resources. I'm so pleased to have collaborated with my colleagues at the German Center for Research and Innovation in New York and the North American liaison offices of University of Freiburg and the University of Cologne on this series. Heidelberg University has been shaping the future since 1386. As a university of excellence, we focus on striking a balance between promoting individual disciplines and bringing together skills from across disciplines to create new structures. With one foot grounded in tradition and the other in innovation, Heidelberg strives to increase transfer of research results into society in order to find solutions to complex societal challenges. One example of a complex societal challenge is understanding the relationship between urbanization, climate change, and the health of urban dwellers. Today's expert, Professor Dr. Rainer Sauerborn, will discuss the health impact that climate change has on urban populations and how climate-friendly actions can create win-win situations for city dwellers. Professor Sauerborn is a senior research professor at Heidelberg University and served as head of Heidelberg Institute of Global Health from 1997 to 2016. He is trained as a pediatrician at the Heidelberg University Medical School, after which he earned a doctorate in public health from Harvard University. His multifaceted career has taken him around the world with work in the United States, Europe, Africa, and Asia. Professor Sauerborn has several years of experience developing massive open online courses, or MOOCs, including one currently in development with the University of Paris on climate change impact on physician care. We're very much looking forward to hearing from Professor Sauerborn today, and we are also looking forward to a lively discussion after his remarks. We invite all of you to ask questions using the chat box, or as Julia mentioned, by raising your virtual hand once we are in the Q&A session. Thank you for joining us today, Professor Sauerborn. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind invitation and the kind words of introduction. For me, it's new to interact with this office of Heidelberg University. I should have known that for long, but that is first for me. So I'm happy to share with you some thoughts, and I'll share my screen now. Hopefully you see it. Just a second. And there we go. Do you see it? Do you see my screen? No? Again. Now you see it, right? but you still don't see. That should be better now. Yeah, is that okay? And you hear me all right? You see me all right? The lighting is good? Okay, so I can start. But it starts with the second slide. Oh, I start with the discussion slide, just a second. That's something wrong. I should start with the beginning. There we go. Okay. So a fancy title, bottom up meets top down. These are the very common terms that policy speak entails, and you will see what I mean by that. The subtitle is How Urban Citizens Can Reap Health Benefits from Climate-Friendly Action. So I talked to you at the interface of urbanization, global urbanization, climate change, and health. And each of these topics would benefit from a whole series of presentations. So I have to focus, and I want to give you a brief overview about what climate change does to cities. A lot has been shown already by my predecessors, particularly by Frauke. But I just want to give 4 slides on climate change, then on cities, and then on health. And then in the health part, I focus on these co-benefits. Many of you won't know what this is, but bear with me, I'll explain them to you. So the key point I will make today and share with you for discussion is cities are not only key for solving the climate change problem, but they are the key. I have worked all my life in rural areas, I must admit, and have done research in urban areas, but we must master cities to solve the climate issue. And also health, as already more than half of the population of the world lives in cities. The global health can only improve by taking urban populations on board. Second point, urban populations are at high risk of health impacts of climate change. I wouldn't say higher risk than rural populations, but different risk. And 3, urban population have, that's the positive news, have many opportunities for mitigations, are better equipped to address climate change in many ways as rural populations. And you will see these terms, which I will explain: mitigation, adaptation, and co-benefits. These are ways to address, if you like, to fight against climate change and protect health at the same time. You've seen some of these graphs, but most of the graphs that you've seen stopped at the you see my cursor, it's a little bit small here. Stopped at this second, from the left, second red bar, namely at 2100. You see this hockey stick. Yes, we don't see much right now in terms of increasing. We are already here at 1 degree. So this graph is maybe 5 years old or 8 years old. I just see on the bottom. So we are already at 1 degree, but even at 1 degree, you don't see much difference between these different scenarios which describe the effect of policy. We can choose between these pathways. And what the usual graphs that stop here don't tell you that the no business as usual one, this goes through the roof. It doesn't even stabilize, not even at 12 degrees. After 2100, and this graph here goes until 2300. So only the very virtuous, very strict path where we have to push all the buttons of climate policy makes the goal of 1 point. This is this line here. This is 1.5 degrees. Is only certainly reached by a very, very aggressive climate policy, and we are not there. Where we are is at 3 degrees with those commitments that nations have given. Commitments, not yet realization. So there's a lot to do on climate policy, and we all need to influence policy as we can. under the worst, don't forget about these terms here, that's called the RCP 8.5, the capacity of the human body, that's IPCC, last report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It even exceeds the capacity of the human body to regulate the temperature. And so that maybe areas won't be able to be inhabited anymore. So the upper one is no option. We need to push degrees warming down. Now, what not everybody knows, that if it warms, if the planet warms, the extreme events get more likely. You see that here. If there's only one standard deviation, or let's say it's not 1 degree of warming, but it's 1 unit of warming, you get this likelihood of very extreme weather, whether it's flooding or heat. If you have 1.5 warming units, you will get this. And so it gets more and more extreme. And that's what we see already in the news every day almost. Even this cold event now today in Germany and Europe could be linked to the different climate that we experience. You also should know that climate change is global, yeah, right, but it's not evenly distributed around the globe. You see here in the top right globe, you see that the temperature, which is dark red, is increasing in terms of degrees much more towards the poles where the ice caps are, which is very unfortunate, than, let's say, in the middle here at the equator. The rainfall has a very difficult pattern. You can't describe it in a single sentence. So it may be global, but it's not the same everywhere. Now I will show you this thing, which is this equation, which is a nice guide. I use it always with my students, a nice guide to know where we can reduce CO2s. This is CO2. So, of course, CO2 is dependent on the number of people that we have on the planet. Then it depends on how much economic activity every person on the planet does, and how much energy this economic activity consumes, and then how much fossil content the energy production generates. If everything was electric and we would not use any fossil, we wouldn't even talk about CO2 and climate change. But there is a substantial amount of CO2 in energy. There's a substantial amount of energy in the GDP, very different. The United States uses double the amount of energy per unit of GDP as Europe or Japan, for example. So this is getting more GDP done with less energy, which basically efficiency. And this is the GDP per person. Of course, we vary a lot how much we use. The rich countries use much more. They have much more GDP per person than the poor countries, obviously. And then that's the population. Okay. So now with all this, we have a certain amount of CO2 that's emitted, and that leads to climate change, which can lead to disease, and that can, God forbid, lead to death. We try to do something against this to protect the population. That means we adapt. That's called adaptation in climate jargon. And then we feed this back to policymakers, maybe at the COP26 this year, and we say, hey, if you don't reduce emissions, if you do not mitigate, if you do not do climate policy, you will not only do a lot of things to the planet and to the oceans and the glaciers, but you will do a lot to health. And so you have a health motive to do something about climate change. So let's now look at the last term I want to explain to you. So there was adaptation, which means climate change is happening, but we try to protect the health of the population to avoid disease. Then there is mitigation, which means to go upstream and stop climate change or reduce climate change, reduce emissions. And now, while we do this, while we do climate policy, there are some policies that generate at the same time health co-benefits that improve health. So in all these bad news about, oh, it's terrible, oh, there's this disease and that disease, there's a good news, namely, there are many actions that are both good for the climate and good for health. And we'll talk about this. And you see here why cities are important. Cities have 70% of GDP. Remember my equation there. It's not my equation, but the equation I showed you. They have 60% of global energy consumption and 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. So without, what can you do without cities? Nothing. So we need to look at cities when we talk about climate change. And they only have 2% of land surface, not surprising. Good. Now, I turn to co-benefits because that's the focus of my talk. And I will explain a little bit what it is, and then I'll give you really, it won't be boring, a lecture kind of thing, but I will give you a case study for European cities that we undertook 3 years ago and show you the results. So I not only show you what health co-benefits are, but I show you that what role they can play in convincing urban citizens to do something for climate and for health. So here's the climate benefits. If we, and you go through the list, if we reduce emissions, from coal and from cars, then we get, and now I show you, we get less asthma, less respiratory disease, less diabetes, you may be surprised to learn. If we provide access to voluntary reproductive health, we get better maternal and child health. You remember that graph started with the number of population numbers on the planet. And if we do, for example, voluntary family planning, reducing in the long run the numbers, not only do we avoid further extreme climate change, but we improve the health of mothers and children. If we shift household consumption away from meat, we do something for the climate, because in order to produce that meat, you need a lot of emissions. But you also get less cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, other cancers, and you avoid a lot of heart disease. So eating less red meat is good for your health, it's good for the climate. If you walk or go take your bike instead of taking your car, it's good for the climate, but you lose weight, you get a lower risk of diabetes, better heart and mental health. If we have cool roofs and cool streets, I can't get into this, but there are some ways of cooling down homes and cities without any technical, without air conditioning and without any technical wizardry. So it becomes cooler in your home. That is good for your heart health and for their mental health. If we insulate homes, it's good for your mental health because you don't have so much noise also coming in. And if we do urban greening, it's good for your mental health and for your heart health because you're more likely to walk in the parks or wherever you plant trees. So you see, there are a lot of climate actions or policies on the left side that generate at the same time health. And I told you I wanted to give you a quick overview of what the health impacts are. This is now infectious diseases. You know that probably from TV and others. In urban settings, it's mainly dengue, which is a disease that is like a very, very severe flu, but can also lead to complications. Heat stress is prominent in cities because cities are hotter than the rural areas because of all this concrete and this glass and corrugated iron homes. So heat stress is more prominent in cities than in rural areas because of poor housing, the roofs, the heat island effect. In blue, it is the explanation why it is so. And in red, it's something that is particularly true in urban settings. Of course, climate change acts everywhere on people's health, but in urban settings, that's the main thing. Asthma and respiratory health, it's because of this pollution you just saw in the previous slide. If you do this energy production in cars, then you also get this respiratory problems. And more 30%, I think, of megacities, that's what Frauke said, are at the ocean. So they are at sea level. Any flood coming in will lead to drowning and injury. Undernutrition is also a problem in cities, although it's more prominent in rural areas. In cities, there can be disruption of food supply because of an extreme event or because of drought in the surrounding areas. Diarrhea, you know why? If it's flooded, if it's crowded, and poor sanitation, that is just a breeding ground for diarrhea. And climate change makes it only worse because if temperature increase, then also the bugs multiply more frequently. And mental disorders also in urban settings, because crowding and heat both lead to increased aggression, increased violence. That has been shown. And also there's a lot of influx of migrants, and migrants are very vulnerable population because they have left their more or less stable, if difficult to live in environment, and now they find themselves in a different social setting. But there's not only bad news. Cities are also very resourceful, and that's very often overlooked. They're not only, in many people's minds, yes, particularly in poor countries, they are dirty, they are slums, they are just a nightmare. But that's a little bit wrong, as you will see. The health, even in cities like Calcutta or Delhi, it's still better, the health indicators, than in the rural areas. Or in the rural areas, they're even worse. Many people don't know that. They have better access to health services, because it's also close and there's always a nephew or an uncle that helps you. So they are better served by health services than rural, remote population. That's even true in the United States, for example, that rural health is worse and the access is worse than urban health. And there's such a vibrant setting of community organizations. That's the bottom-up thing, you know, NGOs, very active citizens. There's better access to information, to TV, to internet, and so it's amazing. So cities have also a lot of possibilities. Okay, with these kind of preliminary remarks, I want to take you on a journey to this project, which is taking place. You see this, the flags in the top left corner, in Germany, in France, in Norway, and in Sweden. And it's over. The project is over since 2 years, and we have some results. What did we try to find out? We took the carbon footprint of a random sample of households in 4 cities. In Germany, it was Mannheim, next door to Heidelberg. And in these other countries, it were different cities. Okay. And we wanted to find out, if we tell people, hey, if you do this and that, not only it's good for the climate, so you reduce your carbon footprint, but it's also good for your health. And we did this in a way of what we call the randomized controlled community trial. So we tried really to do it with rigor and thoroughly. And this will lead to these issues that Frauke and Butch showed in their presentation. I take this off again, where he showed the society left, the environment in the middle, and health systems, and they all converge here on the health status of urban population. That's very important, that health is not only dependent on health services, obviously, but on all the other societal and environmental things. And here he writes, or she writes, both write, lifestyles, health knowledge, health practices. And this is touched upon by our project. So we are trying to ask ourselves, what role do citizens have to reduce emissions? Do they want to do this? What does the state or the public sector, top down, if you like, need to do to help them do what they can do? And what role does the health argument play? Do we make it easier for households to say, oh, I will do this, I will take my bike, I will do this? If we tell them, hey, you also become more healthy, it's much more personal than helping the climate, And all these red framed terms are touched upon by the project. So it's a kind of case study for what my predecessor showed, and also with a focus on lifestyles and on reaping or generating positive health effects of climate action. This is not only true in Europe. We are trying to show this also in Indonesia and in Vietnam and other countries. So it is a case study from Europe, but not only applicable to Europe. But let's stick with Europe and this case study. So in high-income countries, more than 50% of emissions are controlled by household consumption decisions. So you and me, if you come from these countries, you control it. And it's easy to point to big companies, to cement. Yes, it's true, to car companies and so forth. But you buy a car and you consume. And if we as citizens, we made climate-friendly decisions, how we consume, what we eat, how we move, how we travel, then we can do a lot. That's not everybody will agree with this. Many people say this is victim blaming. We should only look at policymakers to save us from climate change. But I think it's both, bottom up and top down. We found out that in these 4 countries, in these 4 cities, a household has 65 options to reduce their household's global carbon footprint or greenhouse gas footprint. And many of them, 13, generate health co-benefits. So not everything generates co-benefits. If you buy a less emitting fridge, less electricity consuming fridge, you don't get more healthier. You don't get healthier, but you do something for the climate. But if you eat less red meat, you get both benefits. You understand? So, and the question was, if we tell them, here are your options, your household can do this and this and this and this. In which sequence, how would you like to do this? And would that change if we told you that this and this measure is also healthy for you? And so we'll skip that one here. So here's what we did. We started with a questionnaire on, we come to your house and tell you what your carbon footprint is. That's our service. That's what we give to you. And then in the second visit, we say, for your household, you have so and so many options, exact options. And if you do this, you will reduce the footprint by so and so many kilograms of CO2. It will save money or cost money, and whether you get or don't get health benefits. Yeah. And then they answered this. It's a kind of it's theoretical, but it's accepted in science. If you can't look at real behavior, you look at expressed behavior. There are some tricks to make sure that this is not too much of what people really would do. Okay. So then we said, look, the EU wants you to reduce, at that time it was the policy, your carbon footprint as much as any sector of society by 50% by 2030. So what would you do? And then we calculated this. People had a laptop. Okay, you have only reduced for 35%. You need to push harder. That was the second round. So we assumed that if they didn't do it spontaneously, express it spontaneously, these options now that they select in the second round, which we called a little bit dramatically forced scenario, then we said these options, they are very difficult. So at least here, the public needs to help households to do what they can. Then we did some in-depth interviews to better understand why people chose what they did choose. Okay, so that was the kind of setup. These were the cards that we showed them. Well, and then we split the sample, that's important, in a group whom we told the health benefit and another group whom we didn't. So by the difference, we tried to tease out whether telling them about the health co-benefits, using this in social promotion, if you like, whether it changes anything. And this is just the results on these 4 issues. Would you change your travel pattern, go on foot or take a bike? How about food? Would you change new windows or do something to your house if you own it? And would you reduce your other consumption? You see, other consumption, no, we don't want to reduce a lot of, what Amazon sends you. But the most relative reduction that they voluntarily accepted was food. I like to eat more climate friendly. Less dramatic was it in mobility, although mobility was much more the footprint by your travel, our travel behavior is the largest. That's the violet one. And the green one is by food, and then housing comes the next. That's what households can do, right? So this is not so dramatic. And if you push people, of course, then they get to somewhere around 50%. Good. And that is also interesting here. If you ask them, they give several options. One is to improve efficiency. That was easy. So the larger the column, the easier it was for the household to do this. We had psychologists on board who figured out to translate it, what people said, into ease of application. It improve efficiency, substitute something for something else, reduce behavior. I fly only once a year instead of 3, or renounce. Renounce was the toughest. Few people wanted to renounce completely of something. Yes, if I can substitute, meat by tofu, that's okay. But if you want me not to fly at all, I'm not game. Okay. And now comes the bottom line. Those households whom we told that these and these actions are also good for your health were much more willing to do climate-friendly actions. So it is a good idea in the public promotion of climate-friendly behavior to use the health argument. That's the bottom line of this survey. And this is a graph from a paper that came out of this, one of the papers. You have the public sphere, you have here how households try to balance their preferences. Oh, I want to travel to my daughter in California and I don't want to give up. So there's the individual sphere, my personal values, my health. It's one of many, but a very strong motivator. Convenience, financial consideration, my knowledge, these are things that are personal. And then there is always this pointing to, but nobody else does it. Or there are no there are no bike paths. Or the public should reduce the train tickets. So there's the public sphere, there's the citizens who said the public needs to help us do what we want to do, but it's too difficult for us. This is what I mean with top down meets bottom up. The bottom up, if you like, is the individual sphere, what citizens can and want or don't want to do. And the public sphere is how public policy meets and encourages or supports these behaviors. So the conclusion of the HOPE study, and that's the last but one slide, the conclusion of that case study is we should disseminate the message to households and policymakers. Health co-benefits are immediate, huge, and effective for behavioral change. The huge is taken with a grain of salt. It depends, of course, on the setting. We should ask, let's top down now, please, policymakers, incentivize households for actions that are less popular for them, that they have more difficulties to do. Keep in mind, more than 50% of the households' carbon of a country's carbon footprint is controlled by households. So here is the key. And we did the study in urban settings, and I think urban settings are much more conducive to do this. Use the positive health argument of co-benefits in climate policy legislation and for individual behavior. This is now a slogan that's a little bit overdrawn, like most slogans, but a climate-friendly world is a healthy world. That is the message. So we come full circle now. It is possible, it should be possible to match individual preferences of citizens in cities with public policy to unleash the potential of their climate-friendly action that makes them also healthier. And I repeat my key points. Cities are key for solving the climate change problem. Urban populations are at high risk. Urban populations have many opportunities for mitigation, adaptation, and co-benefits. I didn't get into detail, but when we went to Mannheim, there were 59 in that little part of the town where we did our survey. There were about 59 climate committees, actions, biking groups. So the mayor had a specific department of climate change with a very active lady who would run filming things and distributing leaflets. So it came from both the top down and from these community grassroots organizations. It was extremely vibrant to see this. I think urban populations do have that advantage of having so many active organizations and sometimes also active mayors and policymakers. So let's use the co-benefits to just one aspect of the whole conundrum. Let's use the co-benefits to improve urban health and urban climate. That's my talk. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't run over time too much.
Not at all. Thank you very much, Professor Sauerborn. At this point, we would like to invite anybody to ask a question who may have one. Again, you can either type it into the chat window or raise your hand virtually.
Shall I leave this share on it, right?
I think that might be helpful in case anybody is referring back to your key points. In the meantime, I have a question for you. Just thinking about the cities you focused on in the project, being in Europe and likely having well-developed infrastructure, for example, for things like recycling or public transportation. Did you see a big change in the impact as opposed to, say, if the study were carried out in US cities?
You mean we have not carried out the similar study in low income countries yet, if that's what you're asking. So we are trying to get funding. Would be a great thing to do it. And there's interest from partners, as I said, in Indonesia. These are the mid-income countries. So it will be difficult probably to do this, let's say, in Somalia or in Chad. But in these middle-income countries where you have part of the population is living a Western lifestyle, it means there are many rich people and many middle-class people in these cities for whom this might be very appropriate. Whether it can be done in informal settings or slums, I don't know. One would have to figure out.
Thank you.
So you read the chats to me?
Yes. What is the feasibility of implementing the services to households that you provided during the HOPE project on a larger scale? For example, the carbon footprint analysis and talking with them about suggested steps and doing follow-up.
Yeah, and that's always, of course, if you do a study, that's always your wish and your hope that this can be scaled up. What we tried everything. We went to Brussels and had three very high level representation of directorates there, and we said this was for you, this study, because it's your, and it was financed by the EU, by the way. It's your policy, 50% for everybody, industry, transportation sector, housing sector, all sectors need to reduce. And here is something how we can generate the potential of urban citizens. And they were extremely interested. And of course, we will see whether this now is brought up into legislation. So far, households are not yet targeted with kind of emission targets, but it will come. As, for example, the health sector has not yet got a target, although the health sector has a very large footprint. They are focusing on the energy sector, cement and industry sector for the moment. So it's a kind of unused resource, is the willingness of households to contribute. Yeah, that's the answer. So it would be great if once you got such a finding, it would be scaled up immediately, but there's a long way between knowing something and implementing this in the long run at larger scale.
Okay. And a related question, if you think about state budgets and there being limitations, do you feel that a state incentivizing mitigation efforts by individuals is more effective than supporting large-scale mitigation efforts, for example, in industry or agriculture, in achieving the overall reductions in climate change?
Well, I can just, I wouldn't pit one against the other and say this is an either-or problem. For example, Lidl, one of the big, retailers in Germany, they said, okay, this meat is much too cheap. We increase the price of the meat, and at the same time we make sure that the pigs are and the cows are. No, it was pig meat. It was pork, and so that they are in decent conditions. So they increased unilaterally the price of pork, but the others, Aldi and the others, didn't do the same, and they were nobody wanted to buy their meat. So. Is this industry who doesn't offer it, or is it the household who doesn't buy it? If electric car is the same thing, you cannot blame Daimler for not producing enough electric cars if there's no demand. So I think this bottom up and top down, they belong together, and you need to act on both sides. If the public doesn't consume differently and doesn't change a lifestyle, if everybody flies 3 times to Mallorca and to Bali for vacation, then this cannot be solved. I think we need both. And unfortunately, very often the households and the citizen responsibility is not taken into account. It's like we are just the victims, although we are also the perpetrators of climate change.
Okay, very interesting. Just to shift gears here a little bit with another question, are there any indices that have been developed showing the relationship between the mean suffering level of a nation or region's people in relationship to climate change events?
Sorry, the mean what? I didn't catch that.
Suffering?
Suffering.
Means, yes.
So the kind of disease burden, is that what
that's my guess.
So between the
disease burden of a nation or a region's people in relationship to climate change events.
Oh yeah. Unfortunately, I didn't have it on this presentation. I can show morphed maps, morphed, M-O-R-P-H-E-D, so that show the country size not as they are, but in relationship to the size of their carbon footprint. And maybe you've seen that. You see the US and Europe really blown up, and Africa and South Asia, they are very small because they have not contributed historically to the problem of climate change. Although they are contributing now, particularly with China leading, a lot. Anyways, so the perpetrators of climate change are northern, and the sufferers of climate change are southern. And this is so unjust that those countries who are struggling anyways with health and with sanitation and all these issues of development, that they get punished, if you like, by a behavior that was not theirs. So yes, it is inversely related. Those who did not contribute to climate change suffer the most, health-wise and otherwise, economically and so forth. Unfortunately.
Okay, another question relating back to the previous topic. Financial considerations are a major setback for many people, even in highly developed countries. What can cities do to help their citizens? Often the public wants to consume differently, but cannot afford to.
Yeah, good point. Very good point. That's what I mean. I mean, you can subsidize, you can reduce taxes, you can do financial incentives. For example, in Germany, the debate was once, and should be, I think, to shift the tax burden from labor, from income tax, to ecological tax. So make my work less taxed, so I get a higher take-home salary. But if I switch on the lights and if I use anything, if I open the windows while I heat my house, or any fossil use is taxed enormously. That would give the right incentives. A carbon tax, everybody who is dealing with this, every economist suggests a carbon tax across the board, like a sugar tax or like a tobacco tax. You have to tax the bad things and subsidize the good things. But nobody wants to do it because it's, of course, meeting a lot of resistance. If one does it and the other don't, then you get competition differences. And so that's the issue. But yes, it is financial is a big lever to do something from the public side. And it should be done. The best thing would be just to tax it, and then everything that is involved with having a carbon footprint would become more expensive. But you have to compensate the citizen by making things that are not noxious for the climate less expensive. And in the end, he should be at least as good off as well off as before, if not better. For example, in Switzerland, I like this. They said we tax carbon. They are at I think they are at $80 per ton of CO2. The EU is only at 20, or Germany is at 25 or 30, and they give back that money before Christmas as a check to each citizen. They say, we don't want your money, but we want to make it, we want to change your behavior, and we give you the money back. Please use it for climate-friendly stuff. It's much better than in Germany, where you get, we reduce the price of electricity a little bit. We give you here a little bit more, so people don't feel it. So there's a lot between financial constructs like taxes, subsidies, and doing the things that have an emotional or a psychological impact. That's
very interesting. Okay, we have another question. This study focused on established cities. What are the potential take-home messages for a rural township that is upgrading into a city? What can citizens do differently from the onset to be climate change compliant?
From a rural, also a growing, you're talking about a growing town that becomes a city. Well, I'm not an expert, but I would assume when you are growing and you can still control that growth, that a lot can be done in terms of making more space for green. Making, for example, we have a project which I couldn't show in sub-Saharan Africa where we put a certain insulation. It's not a paint. It's a substance that reflects the sunlight like a mirror almost. At the same time, it insulates. So the huts are now several degrees cooler than without that stuff. You know, that would be something if you do this on all corrugated iron roofs, which is the standard, of course, of low income roofs. And they are like an oven. If you have entered such a hut with a corrugated iron, it's hotter than inside. Sorry, it's hotter than outside. So it's just a nightmare to live in there if it's very hot. And if you put this stuff on it, and then you can also, so by building the short messages, by influencing how the city is built, you can do a lot. There's this heat island effect. Cities are 3 to 2 degrees warmer than the rural areas surrounding them because of a lot of things, the concrete, lack of greenery, and so you can change city construction, urban planning. That's a very important point. Of course, also mobility planning, having enough space for walking, biking, having good public transportation. Don't give too much space to cars. So if it's growing, there's maybe a chance to do things right rather than let it, autonomously and wildly grow in a kind of unplanned way.
Great. And we have time for just about one more question, I think. This is about Latin America. This audience member is asking if you could talk a little bit about Latin American cities and whether or how they are dealing with health issues in their urban planning.
Oh, I wish I could. I am really not a specialist of urban planning or of urban development, and unfortunately not a specialist of Latin American cities, but I would assume they are somewhere in between the problems and the strength of urban cities in let's say the US and Europe, and the large cities in Africa and Asia. So we know that in many countries, particularly in Brazil, there's a lot of poverty in cities, a lot of slums and favelas. So you have the rich and the poor just next to each other. So I think it is a little bit a mix of the rich countries and the poor countries with a sharpened inequity of people living in cities, which brings a lot of problems. You have the problems of the overeating middle and rich class, and you have the problems of the undernourished poor living just a kilometer away. You have problems of peace and riots. So there's a lot to be said, and I'm not an expert, so I feel a little bit uncomfortable. Are you from such a country? Then you are the expert. Can you ask that back? Or
yes, let's just give them a minute to respond.
Bing.
I believe this is the same audience member. They said thank you.
That was Mrs. Sosa, okay, or Mr.
Yes.
Sosa. Mhm.
So, well, that's the end of our questions, which brings us just nicely here within the hour. So I want to thank you very much to our audience members for joining and engaging in this discussion. And thank you very much to Professor Sauerborn for leading us in this engaging discussion. I think you've given us a lot to think about, particularly in top-down and bottom-up meeting in the middle.
It was a pleasure for me also to meet you all, and hope it was somehow stimulating and useful.
Absolutely. I would also like to thank the co-organizers of the Sustainable Megacity series, Dr. Eva Bosbach at the University of Cologne, New York office, and Ms. Marta Miller at the University of Freiburg liaison office, and our host, the team at the German Center for Research and Innovation. So thank you all again, and we hope you will join us for the 4th event in the series on May 5th, 2021. And please watch social media for more information. And in the meantime, a recording of today's event will be available on the website.
Thank you for a great organization and a great event. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sauerborn.